Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming today, despite the weather. Despite it being probably the last event on a Friday afternoon for all of you and the weather, thank you all for coming. My name is Victor Chai. I'm a senior advisor and Korea Chair here at CSIS, and we are very fortunate and grateful to have our good friends from the ASAN Institute with us today to present on some research that they have been doing on Korea and East Asia. I want to extend a welcome, of course, to my good friend and colleague Ham Jae-bong, who is the director of the ASAN Institute for Policy Studies, and who will be, I guess, offering us some closing remarks. If you'd like to say anything to start, we can do that as well.
Just to say thank you, Victor, for arranging this, and thanks everybody for coming to this. I know what a great risk you are taking at this point in this weather, coming here and delaying your trip back home. But thanks again, and I hope this meeting makes it worthwhile you taking that risk, and I look forward to a lively discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. You have the topics there before you today. I mean, the general topic is on Beyond Ideology, Changing Public Opinion in the 2012 South Korean presidential elections. Having spent some time with some of the fellows from ASAN who are going to present today, I think they are really doing some of the really interesting and substantive cutting-edge research in Korea these days. A lot of which goes against the current literature and conventional wisdoms, and that's what good research is supposed to do. So we're very fortunate to have the opportunity for them to be here to present some of their findings. As you can see, we're going to try to do 3 panels with discussants and questions in an hour and a half. So we're going to try to go through this fairly quickly and efficiently. The first presentation is on shifting political grounds in South Korea, the results of this very interesting opinion survey that the ASAN Institute has done. The 2 presenters are Woo Jung-yup, who is a research fellow at the ASAN Institute. He earned his BA in Business Administration from Seoul National University and MPP from Georgetown, it's a good school, in 2001, and a PhD in Political Science from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in 2009. Prior to joining ASAN, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the KSI, Korean Studies Institute at USC. He was also an associate analyst for Gallup Korea and the Korea Research Company. His areas of specialty include foreign military intervention in civil wars and the relationship between foreign policy making and public opinion. Speaking next will be Kim Ji-yoon. Kim Ji-yoon is a research fellow at ASAN. She received her BA in Political Science and Diplomacy from Yonsei, her MPP in Public Policy from Berkeley, and a PhD from MIT. Prior to joining the ASAN Institute, she was a lecturer at Concordia University, Sukmyung Women's University, and Chungang University. She also was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Montreal. Her research interests include elections, voting behavior, political economy, American political development, and political methodology. And then the discussant for the panel is Scott Snyder, who we all know well here. Scott is director of the Center for U.S. Korea Policy and senior associate of Washington programs at the Asia Foundation. He's also a senior associate at Pacific Forum CSIS and was recently named an adjunct senior fellow for Korean Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Scott received his BA from Rice and his MA from Harvard. So this is what I am told we are doing. The presenters will come up here and give their presentations, and then they will go and sit down, and the discussant will sit in his chair and give his presentation, and then we will try to take maybe one question just to encourage some interaction before we move to the next panel, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. So that's at least the plan. So Dr. Woo.
Thank you, Dr. Choi, for this opportunity, and thank you all for coming today, despite of this inclement weather. Today's topic of presentation is ideological cleavage, partisanship, and its implications for the presidential election 2012 in Korea. even though we are going to talk a little bit about presidential election 2012, but I'm not going to tell you who's going to be the next president of the South Korea. We want to take this opportunity to introduce the ASAN Institute survey series. We have big survey. Based on this, we wrote this presentation. It's called ASAN Institute Public Opinion Survey 2010, and it's going to be conducted annually. And we cover the issues across North-South relations, nuclear North Korea, ROK-US alliance, and some neighboring countries' views of, toward neighboring countries, and also economic issues such as taxation, income redistribution, economic growth, labor union. Also, we include the social issues like gay rights, abortion, and immigrant issues. And for this survey, we interviewed 2,000 people with the method of face-to-face interview. And this year, we launched the monthly survey. It will be conducted every month. And main topic of this survey is about presidential job approval ratings and issue ownership by the major political parties in South Korea. We use the RDD and the probability sampling for this monthly survey, and we had 1,000 samples every month. And the other survey that we are now planning is the special survey on fair society. And this is also going to interview 2,000 people face-to-face. And the outcome will be released in maybe, hopefully, July or early August. And occasionally, we did the breaking polls. The first one we did in this category is the one that we conducted after Yeonpyeong shelling. So to tease you a little bit, I'm going to tell you that what kind of outcome we got from the monthly survey in January. President Lee's job approval rating is the first question that we asked to the respondents. And the approval is 44.4%, whereas the disapproval is 46.7%. Before our survey, it is argued that the presidential job approval is way over the disapproval, but our survey revealed that actually there is more disapproval than approval for presidential Lee's job performance. And this is kind of a controversial question in Korean media last week, so we were very much criticized to include this questionnaire. We asked the respondents whether they are going to vote for the candidates from presidential party or candidates from opposition party in next presidential election. We include this question because in Korean presidential election in 2007, we thought that the opposition, at that time, ruling party candidates' low vote is pretty much affected by the low job approval of the incumbent president at the time. So we saw that the incumbent president approval is highly related to the candidates from the same party. Before this survey, most Korean media reported that Congressman Park Geun-hye would be the strongest candidates for the next presidential election. But our survey revealed that the support for the candidate from the ruling party is 35.4%, whereas the support for the candidate from opposition party is 36.8%. So statistically, this is the same, but this goes against the conventional thinking that the candidate from 한나라당 would be the next president. So this was very controversial. And the party preference, still Grand National Party is 30%. Democratic Party is 17.9%. Democratic Labor Party ranks third with 33.1% preference. So what did we do with the ASAN Institute Public Opinion Survey 2010? in terms of conservative and liberals in South Korea, we saw that it is determined by their attitude toward North Korea. So we think that it's easy to define conservative or liberals in terms of their attitude toward North Korea. But we also want to know how about the economic issues and social issues. Economic issues might be easier, but we don't know how people think about social issues. Traditionally, there has been no political stance expressed by political parties, so we don't know yet how people think about social issues when they think that they are conservative or liberals. So is conservative in North-South Korea issues also conservative in other issues? So if you are conservative in North Korea issues, then are you also conservative in gay rights or abortion or immigrant issues? So how they are different and what's the implications of this difference in politics? That's the real research questions that triggered this public opinion survey. And these are some interesting results of the survey 2010. We asked whether Koreans think that reunification is necessary, and about more than 40% of Korean respondents say that reunification is not that necessary. And if reunification makes your economic condition worse, then most people think that unification is not that necessary. However, we also ask another question about the ROK-US alliance, and most people, even though they consider themselves as liberals or progressive, they think that ROK-US alliance is necessary in the future. And this is related to assurance issues in South Korea. And so we ask people if they believe that United States is going to use its nuclear weapons when South Korea is attacked by nuclear North. And it's a split. So about half Korean believes that United States will use its nuclear weapons to protect South Korea, whereas about the other half of Koreans think that United States will not use its nuclear weapons when South Korea is attacked by North Korea's nuclear weapons. And this is very interesting question that there are many op-ed these days that South Korea should have its own nuclear weapons. So we ask general public about whether they think South Korea should have its own nuclear weapons. So about 45% of Koreans think that we don't need nuclear weapons of our own, whereas about 55% of Koreans think that we need our own nuclear weapons. And we also asked same respondents about economic issues, questions, and social issues. These days, there are many debates about the welfare system in South Korea, and to fund those welfare policies, we need to raise taxes. So we ask about the government taxation. And most people think that raised tax is not an option for them. Only 5.6% of respondents say that raised tax is acceptable. And between economic growth and social welfare, most people, about more than half, like 53.6% of people prefer economic growth to income redistribution. And we also ask about the labor union. And most people think that labor union is necessary. And there are strong division between conservative and liberals with regard to this question about the labor union. And we think that because of this labor union issue is pretty much related to social issues. And this is also very interesting because not many Korean surveys have asked these questions before at the same questionnaire with the politics and economic issues. South Koreans still have very negative feelings about homosexuals. More than 85% of Koreans have negative view on homosexuals. And we also asked the question about the migrant workers, and they believe that, and they think the migrant workers disturb Korean society values. 2.6 means that they tend to not agree this statement. So they are favorable to the migrant workers, and because of the social desirability bias, we ask another question: whether they agree with the statement. This is whether they want their children to marry with the foreigners. 28.4% of Koreans think that they cannot accept marriage with a foreigner, and it depends. 12.7% says that it depends on the skin color. 12.5% says that it depends on the where that foreigner came from. 7.5% says that it depends on that foreigner's income level. And it's only 28.9% of Koreans say that whether the potential spouse is foreigner doesn't matter. So it's only 1/4 of Koreans say that it doesn't matter whether their children is going to marry with foreigners. So it goes against with the question above. They are very generous toward those questions, but when it comes to the specific issues, they are still not open to the foreigners. And we asked the respondents whether they think themselves as conservative or liberals. Green color represent the liberals, whereas the blue color represent conservative. As you see here that the older generation tend to have more conservative in their age groups, whereas younger generations tend to have more liberals in their age groups. And this is self-manifested ideology, so this is about whether they believe themselves as conservative or liberals. So we asked the question to detect whether they are really conservative or liberals. And from here, I'm going to hand the mic over to Dr. Kim.
I know this is a little bit weird moment for the transition, but this is how we work at ASAN Institute. Again, thank you for all having come here for our talk. Dr. Wu briefly introduced the aim of our survey and what we studied on and some of the preliminary interesting findings to you. In this session, I'll report some results from in-depth analysis, including some regression results. So we have 3 primary objectives for our study. First, we'd like to find out the ideological position of South Koreans and the partisan affiliation, and also attitude and opinions to various issues, including national security, social issues, and economic issues. And the second, we were interested in how different they are by generations. So it is a widely accepted idea that the younger generation and the older generation in Korea are totally different, and then how they are different and on which issue they are most different. And the third, and then what about the vote choice? Because that's probably the ultimate, most interesting part for all the electoral scholars. So we wanted to look into through our survey. So that was ideology, which is self-manifested. And the second is the partisan affiliation. Korea, unlike the US, we have multi-party systems. So we had to classify the political parties into 2 groups. One is a conservative party group, and the second is a liberal party group. So for example, the Grand National Party, which is the ruling party of Korea currently, is considered to be a conservative party. And also Democratic Party, which is a major opposition party, is considered to be the liberal party group. So when we divide them up, as you see, you can see the very big difference between the 20s and the 60s. Well, the over 60s, about like 47% of them actually identified with one of the conservative parties, and only 22% of them identified with one of the liberal parties. In the 70s, on the other hand, about 32% of them they identified with one of the liberal parties. On the other hand, they only 20% identified with one of the conservative party. But what was very noticeable is the largest proportion of non-partisans among the 20s. So we thought this is really quite interesting phenomenon. Of course, it is because, well, not yet done to socialization by the younger generation, but we also thought maybe there's some another reason. They couldn't find a political party that they can identify with, and also the political parties that are, perceived to be better able to respond to what they are most concerned about. And then, well, so far it was self-measured estimate. So self-measured ideological stance and also self-measured partisan affiliation. So to see the phenomena in a more objective way, we created some index. So we call it conservatism index in 3 categories. First is national security, and the second economic issues, and the third social issues. And we carefully selected 3 or 4 questions from our survey. So for example, in the national security part, we have 3 questions: in what ways to unify 2 Koreas? So when the respondent answered that they prefer the reunification through the South Korea's absorption of North Korea, then they are considered to be conservative. But if they answer that, well, we have to establish the federal system, then they are considered to be the rebel. And the second question, how to deal with North's nuclear threat? So they answered that we have to put more pressure economically and militarily, and they are considered to be conservative. On the other hand, if they think that we have to resolve it as through the economic cooperation and also the peaceful talk, then they are considered to be liberal. And the last, the sentiment toward the US, we have 5 sub-questions about the measuring how favorable the people are toward the United States. So if they are more favorable to the United States, they are considered to be conservative. If they are unfavorable, then they're liberals. And for the economic issues, I know that Dr. Wu explained that in the previous slides. So whether or not they think the government should increase the regulations on the business, whether or not they think that the government should raise the tax, and they prefer the income redistribution over the economic growth, and their attitude toward the labor union, if it's necessary or unnecessary. For social issues, we have 4 questions: migrant workers, their attitude toward the migrant workers, and their attitude toward the homosexuals, and also the legalization of the gay marriage, and also the attitude toward the right to abortion, and finally the preference of individual freedom over public orders. So all the indexes are from 0 to 1. So if it gets too close to 0, then the person is perceived to be liberal. If the score gets close to 1, then the person is perceived to be conservative. And that's the conservative index by age group. So it's for 20s. And as you see, the national security-wise, their conservatism score is 0.59, and the economy is 0.54, and the social issues, they're very liberal on the social issues, and 0.47. And for the generation of 30s, the national security 0.58, which is pretty close and pretty similar to what we saw in the 20s, and economy issue the same as 0.54. And the social issue, they kind of expanded a little bit outward, is 0.51. And, well, I'll just skip here for the time constraint. You see, the triangle is kind of expanding outward as the age cohort gets older. And what is very standing out in the voters in their 60s is national security. Their index score, the conservative index score for the national security is 0.64. So it's quite high, highest. Well, it's not just the national security, but also economic issues, 0.59, and the social issues, 0.58. But what we found was that, well, the 20s, the younger generation, and the 60s, or the older generation, they're accusing each other for being, oh, you're too liberal or you're too conservative, but they are talking different words. Because 20s, they are liberal in the social issues, and 60s, they are conservative on the national security issues. As a matter of fact, the 20s are no less conservative with respect to national security issues, except for the 60s. Because the security conservatism is 0.59 in the 20s, and up to 50s, it's almost the same. So 60s stands out in terms of national security and very conservative, and the 20s stands out liberal in the social issues. Then I'll turn to the regression analysis. So our dependent variables are two here. So first one is the ideological stance, and the second one is partisan affiliation. Because our dependent variable three categories, so I use the multinomial logic model, and the reference group is a liberal or liberal parties. So what determines the person's ideological stance, it turns out the security and the social issues. But if you look at the magnitude of the coefficient, then social issue is most critical factor, actually. So the person has a more conservative attitude toward the social issues, and the person is most critically, place himself or herself as conservative. But on the other hand, in terms of partisan affiliation, it is one and only security matter. Neither social issue nor the economy issue does matter in terms of the partisan affiliation. We see this difference between the ideological stance and the partisan difference coming from that, there's no issue developed by the parties about social issues and moral values and economic issues. On the other hand, national security has developed as a partisan cleavages. So, for example, starting from the Sunshine Policy under Kim Dae-jung government, and its continuation of it by the Moo-hyun government shows that which party is more accommodating to the North Korea, and more of which party is more assertive toward North Korea. And also, if you recollect the 2002 presidential election, then we cannot really deny the fact that former President Roh Moo-hyun, then candidate of New Millennium Democratic Party, took advantage of the anti-American sentiment among the public at that time. So the national security issue became a huge partisan issue, but none of the parties actually brought up the social issues. Where do we stand on the gay marriage? Where do we stand on the abortion? Where do we stand on the immigrant workers? Economic issue is now gradually brought up by the political parties, but the problem is they are sending mixed signals, confused signals to for example, like Grand National Party, which is conservative party, is talking about the welfare. So all the parties are talking about welfare, all the parties are talking about economic growth, so voters are confused that they cannot really get the clue from the parties. So it is what's happening in Korea, so that's why the national security is the most important factor to determine the partisan affiliation and also vote choice. We use the data in our survey, the vote choice of the local election on June 2nd in 2010, and when we had a dependent variables voted for the candidate of the conservative parties, and we see pretty similar pattern what we saw in the partisanship regression. So security does matter, but if you break it into the age cohort, we see some differences. I cut up all the control variables, so and reporting only most important independent variables. It is a security for the age cohort of 50s and 60s, but if you look at those bold characters in the voters in their 30s, it is social issues and economic issues, not security issue. So those who have conservative attitude towards social issues, conservative attitude toward economic issues, tend to vote for one of the conservative party candidates. So you see some huge differences between the age groups, and it is affecting in the voting choices of them in the local election. So that's kind of conclusion that so far I covered up. Well, I know it's hard to talk about and infer from those local election results to the presidential election, because the dynamics behind the local election and presidential election might be quite different. But anyway, if we have some policy implication from our survey and studies, then what we thought is we should emphasize that Korean political parties should not be trapped into the national security framing and go beyond and seek for another issue areas and expand the areas that they cover and stand for. And we thought this quite important because considering the declining turnout, dramatically declining turnout, then that will be the kind of device to mobilize the younger voters who are more interested in social and economic issues than the national security issues. Let me stop here.
Okay, and we'll go to Scott for some remarks or
Okay,
questions.
well, it's a pleasure to be here. I realize that we're already a little bit behind schedule, and so I'm going to try to go through very briefly and just identify a few questions. And also, I mean, this is a very interesting paper. It's obviously very rigorous in its methodology. And there's a lot of things to sift through. For somebody like me, as a policy analyst, I was looking for the headline. And you, I think, got to the headline. But what I took away from this is just one sentence from the paper. Voters' attitude towards social issues is the most important factor in determining a person's ideological position, but national security is the explanatory variable for party choice. For me, that was really the core, and it raises a number of interesting questions that I am just going to pose. It probably reflects more about me than it does about the paper. The first one that I think is a real challenge if you're going to be doing research in this area, especially as we think about Korean behavior, is how do we deal with this gap between ideology and party identification? Or to put it in slightly different terms, how do we measure or take into account the difference between what people think and how they behave? I think that's an enormously challenging task. You can gather the opinions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that in the Korean political system people are going to behave that way. And that leads me to another observation, and that is that clearly South Korean political parties actually have enormous issue flexibility and pragmatism, but members of parties are faced with a certain level of rigidity based on personal loyalties and school ties. And so I find that also to be an interesting challenge, and I'm wondering whether some of this data can play into that in some way. How do we deal with party allegiance versus issue prioritization? Another way of putting it is, why don't I ever see any cross-party issue voting in the National Assembly? Third observation that I would raise, which I think you were kind of getting to at the end, is what would be the implications if the parties were more ideologically consistent? Is that going to be a good thing or a bad thing, especially as we extend to social issues? We have the U.S. as a reference point. I'm going to refrain from commenting any further. And then I've just got a number of specific questions that I'll just put on the table. One is, I got the impression in the paper that there was an assumption, and I'm not sure I understand fully the basis for it, that the ideological split on national security issues aligns pro-U.S. and skeptical of North Korean views. And I just wonder whether it's really that zero-sum, or whether that's an assumption that can be sustained. It may be more today than it used to be, but I'd be interested in, further exploration of that. A second question is, what are the priorities among the social issues? In other words, what social issues can one imagine emerging as political issues? going forward in Korea. And then, another question is, related to the connection between ideology and party affiliation. It seems like there's not a clear connection there. At least I might have missed it in the paper. And then you also presented some information that wasn't in the paper, and especially about the, information on Korean attitudes towards nuclear issues. And I'm just wondering if there are conclusions that you draw from that. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Scott, for a very thorough set of comments and questions. In the interest of time, we will move now to the second presentation on information, heuristics, and the politics of mass protest in South Korea, the case of the anti-US beef protests. Presenting will be Dr. Go Myung-hyun, and his bio is, let me introduce him properly since we should do that as hosts. He is a visiting scholar at the ASAN Institute and a postdoctoral scholar at the UCLA Seoul Institute. He's a graduate of Columbia University, that's a good school, and received a PhD in policy studies from the Rand Graduate School in Santa Monica. His scholastic interests lay with the applying of social network and complex systems theories to solve public policy problems. He's currently working on understanding the mechanisms of public opinion formation on the internet and the geospatial spread of HIV, AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. And
yes.
So why don't you go first, and then I'll introduce the rest of the panel.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Cha. I agree 100% about the school I graduated from. Thank you so much. Actually, it was my childhood dream to present at a place like CSIS, but my childhood dream lasted until I was an undergrad, and then I changed my career and then my goal objectives. But life takes two places, and I'm back here, and I'm very honored and glad. So I'm going to make a presentation about the mass protest phenomena. As you can see, the title is less ambitious than the one you see in the program. It was getting too long, so I tried to cut it down and focus on the essential part of it. So when you talk about Korea and politics, we often say Korea is a land of morning calm, but in truth, we know it's not. It's noisy, dynamic, but there's upside and downside to it. And the same goes to politics in Korea. We know that several key events in modern Korean history involved some sort of mass events. As you might well know about the April 19th revolution in 1960, which toppled the regime of Lee Seung-man, followed by Gwangju resistance movement, and followed by again by the June 1987, which toppled the regime of John Doo-hwan, and the anti-American protest of 2002, followed by the anti-beef protest of 2008. So the reason for all these mass events ranges from, there are different reasons, but usually they are about democratic transition and political issues. But today we want to focus on the last major event, which is the anti-beef protest. And I think that actually the reason for that is related to the title of this presentation, which is the generational transition in the protest culture in Korea. So first, a little bit of background to the protest culture in Korea. What you see there is actually three statistics. There's the freedom index, which is the level of political freedom and freedom of expression, and then followed by the corruption perception index. So these are the left y-axis. And what it indicates is that the lower score actually means better. So lower the score, there's more political freedom and less corruption. And what you see in the red is actually the frequency of protest in Korea. I obtained that from the Korean police. So what you see is that going back to 1995, the two statistics, political freedom and the corruption index, actually it's getting better. It starts from 6, which I mean the index ranges from 1 to 10. So it's getting lower and lower over time, and then there's more political freedom, even though the improvement is marginal. But what you see is that on the contrary to the political freedom and corruption, actually there are more protests in Korea. It doubles from 7,000 events per year to 14,000 And so this is actually, it's very counterintuitive because we don't really know what these people are protesting about. So the reason we are focusing on the 2008 B protest is because it actually combines two cultures. The traditional protest culture in Korea, which you might well know, which is quite violent. It's about throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails. And the new protest culture, which is, some of you might have seen, which is about holding candles, doing sit-downs. So the contrast is huge. And what did really happen in the between? So we're going to, explain more about the B protest. And the reason the B protest happened in 2008, it was motivated by fears of mad cow disease in the U.S. beef. So people believe that by consuming U.S. beef, people contract mad cow disease and die. And we all know, probably some of you already had lunch and we have to consume some of U.S. beef today, but you're all fine. And another thing is, another characteristic of the protest was the massive escalation in the protest size. So it started out very small, like a crowd of like 5,000 or 10,000, which is actually quite small in Korea. And it grew exponentially to like 500,000 people. And the government, of course, lost control of the situation, but then so actually took the hands off, but the situation normalized by itself eventually. So we really don't understand what happened there too. So in this research, we are trying to find out the reasons. So there are different interpretations of the events according to the political affiliation of the analyst or the observer. And of course, the conservatives see the hidden hands of the opposition, or even North Korea, which means that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that they are out there to get you. And then the opposition glorifies it, of course, as a great instance of people struggling for freedom and all that. And we all know that's a dream they're still dreaming. So we argue that both interpretations are wrong. Another characteristic is, but even though these observers, according to their political affiliation, disagree about the nature of the protest, they both agree about the fact that the younger generation, the teenagers and the young people in the 20s, had a really important role in initiating the protest and in the evolution of the protest itself. And unlucky for the government of Lee Myung-bak, this younger generation, they tend to have a lot of leisure time and spend that time online, producing like online contents like YouTube videos and like writing blogs and social media stuff. And in the case of e-protest, they actually, what they did, they used their time to produce rumors and misinformation, such as sending text messages saying that the government is trying to feed you with US beef and you will all die. So that actually galvanized them a lot. And that's quite interesting because this actually marks a generational transition in the protest. Because before, movements happened like hierarchically. You had a leadership group, you had basically examples are like student unions and labor and trade unions and political groups. And the most protests happened with political motivations. They had like a certain political agenda in mind. And then also they had like clear leadership structure. They had like a chairman, a leader, and other like organizations like controlling other subgroups. Now the situation is different. It's more flat in terms of hierarchy. There are no leaders, only followers. So they follow each other in a way like dog chasing its own tail. So it's like a very new phenomena. We try to like break it down with the demographic characteristics, and we break it down with three different dimensions. One is the political leaning and the political participation level, and the attitude towards America. And the younger generation, they tend to be indifferent to everything, like most teenagers. And those people, adults, young adults, not young adults anymore, but those people in the 30s and 40s, which in Korea it's called the 386 generation, tend to be more progressive, and they participate in politics more actively, not just in voting, but in protest and sit-downs and stuff. And their attitude is actually more anti-American, which reflects their formative experience when they're in the 80s when they're growing up. And then there's the older set of population who tend to be conservative. they participate in politics, they turn out in high numbers in elections, but then they don't really oppose the government because they're conservative too. And they tend to be pro-American, which again reflects their formation, because they grew up right after the Korean War in poverty, and they grew up to respect U.S. and the government, the authorities. So here the title says like the 2008 bee protest is a natural phenomenon. What I mean by that is that there are factors that are not just sociological, political. There are like factors that actually that has more to do with physical science. And because when my background is actually, I'm currently being trained as an epidemiologist, and I'm trying to translate some of these epidemic models to social science. And what I see is that the bee protest had this epidemic kind of properties, like there are different groups of people when in an epidemic, and just they are called super spreaders, and in case of fashion and fast, it's called early adapters and heavy users. And so in the case of bee protest, the 10 and 20 set actually worked as initiators of rumors and misinformation. So they started out this misinformation. They actually spread this misinformation across society. So this is actually the daily statistics of protesters, and this actually illustrates the dynamics of the epidemic properties of the protest. So what you see on the left y-axis is the daily number of protesters, and what you see on the right-hand side, the y-axis is the cumulative number of protesters, and what you see on the bottom, at the bottom is the date. So it's a time. So what you see here is that the level of protesters, I mean, daily turnout was pretty much flat for a long time, like almost like a month. But there's a sudden tipping point, there's a sudden surge. So what you see here is that, again, the younger generation starts this weekend protest and in downtown Seoul, followed by the 30s and 40s set during the protest, and actually increasing the size of the crowd. Then it peaks actually the same date, which is the anniversary of the June struggle, which actually has a different meaning. I mean, actually shows that there's certain nature. I mean, actually illustrates the nature of this protest and the evolution of the protest. And after that, for some reason, just peters out, and the demonstration becomes more violent, but it goes away. So what really happened here? So what happened here is that the two generations who have, again, the younger generation in their teens and the 20s, and actually united with the older generation, the immediate older generation of 30s and 40s against the government. And as you remember, as I said before, they have a very different political outlooks. One is very indifferent about politics, the other one is very progressive. So how could the two unite and oppose the government? So, so part of the reason, I mean, part of the logic behind it is the overcoming of the collective action dilemma, which is the free rider problem. So, when we talk about collective action, usually, the reason why collective action is actually a dilemma is because it has this property of a public good. People produce public goods like education, defense. The thing is that you cannot really exclude the benefit of public good to other people. So only a certain group of people borne the cost of producing public good, but the benefit goes to everyone, which means that you have this strong incentive to shirk, meaning like you just free ride on others. So same thing with the collective action. I think a great political scientist Olson made a remark in the 60s that collective action, despite the fact that we see them occurring often, it's actually a very rare event because of this problem of collective action dilemma. So how can you overcome this collective action dilemma? So there are 3 scholars that I cite in order to form this framework of analysis. So first one is Thomas Schelling. He's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. He actually proposed that people have shared this like tacit knowledge, which is people don't really get educated or taught about this knowledge, but share it naturally. And that was a paper published, a book published in the 1960s. And then the idea of concept of minimum coalition, which means that it's the minimum number of people you need to have a coordination with in order to get the ball rolling and produce public goods through collective action. And there's another paper by Professor Lohmann at UCLA. She actually hypothesized that the size of the crowd conveys certain information to the bystanders. So if the crowd gets bigger and bigger, that actually relays the information about the true strengths and the true support level of the certain idea or like political message in the society. And finally, there's a paper by really a famous sociologist, Granovetter, and he actually actually modeled the dynamics of a crowd evolution. How does a crowd from a small number of people gets to grow to be really huge? So I'm going to show you here a really like a serious example of collective action. So bear with me for like 2 minutes. So this is how history is made, in my opinion. So in numbers, what you see here is so what I show you here is that the x-axis is the time. As you can see, for like 1 minute, you have to go through this pain of watching two losers, like dancing, like I don't know, that was sad. But then, like there's an inflection point, between like 70 seconds maybe, when the trend actually changes. The slow growth in the size of the crowd actually jumps, and the crowd actually grows exponentially. So what happened here is that, going back to the framework set up by Schelling and Lohmann and Granovetter, there was the first guy, I'm not going to say anything about him, and then there's actually early adopter, right? The guy who showed up at 17 seconds, I think. The two actually formed this minimum coalition. They actually joined with each other. They coordinated this dance. So as the size of the party actually start growing slowly, more people actually swayed to join the crowd. Eventually, the crowd has to decide. I mean, each individual in the crowd, even though they are not coordinating with each other, have to make a decision. They have to decide whether to join the dance or laugh at them. So eventually, as the size gets really, really huge, the cost about joining the dance, which is the embarrassment, actually decays exponentially, which is essentially 1/n. So by the end of the video clip, you saw that most people actually joined the crowd and the dance rather than sitting on the ground. So that shows that this is actually the basic dynamic of crowd formation. So going back to the 2008 beef protest, you will see that first you had these 10 and 20-year-old initiators. Everyone knew what they are thinking about, that U.S. beef was very unsafe and actually dangerous to consume, was actually very preposterous. But then they've been persisted in actually protesting in downtown Seoul for like a month. So eventually, the older set who we expect to be more rational actually joined the crowd, but for different reasons. There's a tipping point. It peaked, then it suddenly disappeared. So again, in order to make this analysis even more complicated, I'm going to add 2 more concepts to this, which is the idea of timing, because you cannot really start dancing, any time, right? You have to actually check, you have to think about the mood of the crowd. The second is like the location. You can't really start dancing far off from the crowd. You want to start dancing near the crowd so that other people can join you easily. And another thing is echoing the idea of Professor Lohman, the visibility. You have to be located near enough so that the crowd sees you and see your, how do you say, like followers. They're joining in a dance and start dancing. So these are the 2 fundamental factors for the collective action to be successful. So what happened in 2008 is that both the younger generation and the older generation, they are in the mood for protesting, because the younger generation, they got swayed by this rumor about American beef. And the older generation, they are just upset about the losing the election to a guy that they didn't like. So the younger generation formed this initial coalition of the willing. And the older generation actually initiated this tipping point, which actually brought in even more people. So another underlying point is that, going back to the timing and the location, is that people, Korean people, because they've been exposed to so many protests that they actually share a collective learning about the gathering locations. But again, you don't have to think too much about where to gather for protesting, because Korea, the Seoul is actually, it's a big city, but it's very centrally designed. So already in the downtown Seoul, you already have these wide boulevards and plazas, which are served by efficient public transport. So which means that the cost for you to join a protest is actually quite low. So you can see that this is actually a historical thing, because same thing happened in 2002 with the World Cup, and the crowd formed in the locations that 6 years later showed up again to protest against American beef. So in some Korean protests actually happens quite often because there's underlying protesting infrastructure which facilitates the gathering of the crowd. And second thing is, the positive thing is that the younger generation, because they are less indifferent about politics but more concerned about social issues, they're actually protesting because of social issues, rather than politics. So at the same time, they are actually reflecting their own values, which is more peaceful and more actually, I don't know, I should say it's peaceful. And the last thing is that the existing generation, the 30th generation, the 386 generation, because they think, because they are so subsumed into their own cultural protest that they don't really understand the younger generation. They actually couldn't quite understand how these people, the younger generation, even though they initiated this protest which from their point of view was really courageous, how could they just stop joining the protest and go home? And they couldn't understand the fact that the younger generation, they actually put a lot of value in the sense of fun and gathering. So finally, so this is the basic dichotomy, anatomy of a protest culture in Korea. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Ham is going to speak on the next panel, and so he's going to consolidate his remarks for those panels as well as in the question and answer session. So we'll go directly to Gordon. Gordon Flake is the Executive Director of the Mike and Maureen Mansfield Foundation. He's previously a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and then Director of Research at the Korea Economic Institute. Gordon, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Victor. I presume that ASAN will be putting these papers up on their website, and for those of you that didn't have the advantage that I have of reading the paper, I would strongly urge you to go back and read it, because this is really an insightful paper. To begin with, it challenges a lot of the conventional wisdom about those beef protests, those seminal events of the early part of the Lee Myung-bak administration. The problem for me as a so-called Korea specialist is, at the time I look back, and I was a purveyor of a lot of that so-called conventional wisdom in my own explanations as to why it happened. This is not a trivial topic, because if you think about it, a good part of the very first year of the Lee Myung-bak administration was wasted, essentially, because of an unanticipated, very large-scale demonstration that took both the Lee Myung-bak administration and also Washington completely off guard. Now, given Korea's long history of public demonstrations, to say that one was surprised by a public demonstration would be like being surprised by partisanship in Washington, right? But the reality was this was a surprise. It wasn't like there was this, this building angst that people saw coming down the road. There was no major national security issue. There was no major democratization issue. It just kind of, it appeared out of nowhere, and that's why this paper is very useful in kind of helping us understand how something this big, this long-lasting, and so apparently absent in origin could just emerge and so disrupt, a major democracy in the world. I would make just 4 or 5 points. I know we're quite short in time here. First, I think there's a very important lesson for Washington in the era of the Tea Party in trying to understand that not all political movements are led by politicians, and nor do they originate in politicians. And I think one of the real contributions of this paper is it debunks the notion that this was a demonstration organized by and led by the opposition, by the 386 generation. And interestingly enough, at the time, that was a theory that was given to me both by the government and by the opposition, right? The government wanted to blame this on the 386 generation that was computer savvy, and somehow they were sour grapes, lost the election, so they were instigating this crisis. And of course, the 386 generation and the opposition wanted to take credit for it. But this paper does a very good job in outlining in great detail how that really wasn't the case, how the opposition came on later, and actually it was the introduction of the opposition and the politicians and labor and the 386 that actually killed the demonstrations, that made them reach the peak. And that I think is a seminal finding. It's a very important finding as we go forward. It was also a very useful paper in explaining the kind of how and why you got such active networking and involvement of junior high students and high school students in something that was kind of unprecedented in Korean society as you go forward. I have to say it's probably less useful to me in explaining what I think is another key contingent, which is the expansion from that core group that started it to the others. Now, on the one hand, I think the paper does assume that you had the core group of junior high and high school students who were all texting each other and on the internet, and they agreed to get together, and that formed the core. And then later on, the opposition party and the 386 generation, the labor movement kind of hijacked on it. But the truth is that wasn't all. There were also a much broader segment of society that came in. And what this paper really lacks in my mind is the explanatory power to explain why those other elements of society came in at that point, why it got so large. Because it wasn't just 386 and it wasn't just the labor movement as you go forward. And I would make a couple of subpoints in that regard. One, I think this was kind of an issue-specific crisis. I mean, if it hadn't been beef, if it had been widgets or autos, I don't think you would have had the same public response. It was public health, it was sensitivity, you're dealing with their health, you're threatening the health of our children, it was beef in schools, and those issues just made it much more sensitive than almost any other issue I think I could have imagined if you're going forward. Secondly, I think you have to understand in the historical context in Korea. If Korea didn't have this public history of demonstrations by students, you wouldn't have had that same anticipated response. And so the paper does a very good job of explaining how rumors spread among junior high and high school students and how that motivated them to act, right? Well, when I was in high school, there was a rumor that Michael Jackson had a sex change, right? And that rumor spread really quickly without the internet and without texting. We all knew it, but there was no actionable item, right? There was nothing we were going to do. And even if it had been something more senior, there's no actionable item. Whereas in Korea, because partly of their history, but partly because the 386 generation had so lionized the demonstrations, and because it was assumed part of the natural response is if you're upset about something is to go demonstrate, right? And so that's kind of a uniquely Korean historical context thing that I don't think is given enough weight into this process as you go forward. Second issue that I think would be important, or third issue I think would be important to address here is that the role of public expectations vis-a-vis the government. This is one of the explanations given at the time, and I think is given short shrift by the paper, and that is that there was kind of a deep-seated angst, not just about the election of Lee Myung-bak in the election itself, but what happened after the election. So the transition period, a whole series of declarations coming out of the transition office, the Insui, about English language, about a bunch of issues that were shaking people up, and the more important thing was how they were coming out. They were coming out like directives from on high from a very authoritative leader, and this is going to happen. Whereas we had just finished 10 years of progressive government, 5 years of Roh Moo-hyun's 참여 정치, participatory government. And so the people's expectation as to how the government would relate with them was very different. And so the way the beef decision came down, I think also affected the environment, particularly that environment in terms when the broader public would actually join in with the Korean government, with the students, etc. The section of the paper that looks at the facilitating variables for public demonstrations was extremely interesting. At that point there that Seoul offers great infrastructure for protesting. I mean, it's actually very insightful, and it goes through and breaks down everything from public transportation, the cost of participation, the availability of sites, etc. I think there are probably some public officials in Egypt today that would like to read your paper and your recommendations at the end about how you can break that down as you go forward. Yeah, I think they might be hiring you as you're going forward. But overall, I would say the missing point in this paper, the biggest missing point, and I'll kind of wrap up here, is kind of the complete lack of any discussion of a policy response or a lack of a policy response from the Blue House. One of the real contributing factors here was this went on for so long because there was no, in other words, if there had been an information response early on to the misinformation that junior high students were receiving, then maybe that would have been a different strategy. But there's nothing in the recommendations about information strategy or about how do you change public opinion as it shifts or public diplomacy in that regard. More importantly, there's no discussion about how once it does get that big, the role of the government. The Lee Myung-bak administration just hunkered down, and I think they're very fortunate that it did peak and die. And probably they should thank the 386 generation for killing the demonstrations, because otherwise I think they might have been in a much tougher situation. I just wrap up by saying it's a wonderful paper. It's very insightful. I'd urge all of you to go look at the details because there's a lot of meat in there. But it's a paper in the end that's much stronger in explanatory power than in predictive power, because we kind of understand why it happened then, but it's kind of a lightning strikes twice thing. I don't know that by reading this I know when it's going to happen again. So I'll stop there.
Right, thank you, Gordon. With that, we'll move to our final presentation, which is on the politics of national security in South Korea, evolving public perception of the ROK-US alliance. Presenting this will be the director of the ASAN Institute, Ham Jae-bong, who, as you all know, was a very well-known figure in Korea. He was a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation and then director of the Division of Social Sciences Research and Policy at UNESCO in Paris, France. He's held professorships and administrative positions in IR, political science, and Korean studies at USC and at Yonsei University, and has been a visiting professor at Duke, Georgetown, and Princeton, and a visiting fellow at the International Forum for Democratic Studies in Washington. So he did his BA from Carleton and his MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. The third paper is basically still within the same large theme that we're tracing today, whether Korea is moving beyond ideology. And actually there should be a question mark there. That was the original idea, because we weren't quite sure, but I think we're pretty sure. Third and last paper is also largely based upon the opinion survey that we've conducted. Let me just go through some of the key findings, some of the numbers that we found, and then I'll try to interpret that as best I can. And some have already been shown by Drs. Woo Jung-yup and Kim Jun earlier. But for instance, there's a question about, do you believe that the ROK-US military alliance should continue? And of course, regardless of the age group, actually, an incredible number of people said yes, 85.6, 85.6, 86.5. So actually, it's surprising, for some at least, a degree of support for the alliance. Let me just go through our findings. Interesting question. Are you interested in the issue of national unification? And the 20s, 60.8% of those in the 20s said not interested. And So we have the younger generation increasingly becoming less interested in the issue of national unification, which I guess is an indication that nationalism itself is becoming less, because nationalism in Korea is so closely tied with the whole issue of reunification. Do you believe that South Korea can deter North Korea's military aggression without U.S. involvement? Actually, many people say yes, we actually can, right? But still, the support for the alliance. How strongly do you believe that national unification is necessary? This slide was already shown. Again, the younger, fewer number of the younger generation actually think that unification is necessary. Do you support national unification if it hurts economic conditions? And again, the younger generation are very, very practical-minded about such issues. If it hurts my pocketbook, then I'm not going to support this. Are you willing to pay additional tax to help defectors from North Korea? Look at the number of in the 20s, especially. You would think that the younger generation would be more idealistic, but clearly the younger generation says 51.3% says no, just like the majority of those in 50s and older who say no to such questions. Do you believe that North Korea possesses nuclear weapons? Everybody agrees that. Do you think that North Korea will abandon its nuclear weapons? No. Everybody says unlikely. This we went through before, so I'll skip that. Well, this one I'll skip there. Are you concerned about North Korea's nuclear weapons? There's, regardless of the age group, Koreans are very concerned about nuclear weapons. Who is primarily responsible for the North Korean nuclear? It's North Korea. Again, it's very surprising. We would have predicted the U.S. would maybe, especially among the younger generation, but it's still consistently people think it's North Korea. Let me just stop there with the figures, and I'm just trying to put a interpretation on some of these figures, which on the one hand clearly shows that the younger generation is quote unquote conservative, in the sense they strongly support the alliance with the United States. They are less concerned about unification issues, which is different from the older generation, but it's conservative in the sense that the 386 generation, or the very progressive generation, was very much for unification, almost an unquestioned ideal and goal, which apparently for the 20th generation it really no longer is. Now, the way I would look at this is that it really is a there are two sets to this. One is that it's a long-term trend, part of a longer-term trend in which the issue of reunification and the issue regarding our alliance with the United States are becoming less an ideological issue and much more a pragmatic issue concerning national security. And I think it's part of a long-term evolution about Korean thinking on this issue, especially unification. If you think about it, at the beginning of at the start of the beginning of the founding of the Republic of Korea, Korea was liberated because of the United States, and for the first 3 years after independence, it was ruled by U.S. military government. The moment the United States Secretary of State said that, well, South Korea may be outside of its defense perimeter, North Korea launched an attack, and U.S. had to come right back and save the country again. So at the beginning of the founding moment of the Republic of Korea, you know, the alliance with the United States was what South Korea was. I mean, without it, it would not exist. So at the beginning, there was very little questioning of regarding the role of the United States and the importance of it for the national security of the country. So, but then we have the continuing, for instance, economic development of South Korea, which then made it increasingly independent, at least, of the U.S. economic aid of things. And I think by the 70s and 80s, we started to have a younger generation that actually started to question the unquestioning reliance of South Korea upon the United States for its survival, and in fact, in terms of its even national identity, I would say. So once we go through the democratization process, there's a very healthy opening of a debate regarding South Korean national identity, its relation, and the role of the United States in it. And so it's at that period that we see the politicization of national security issues, politicization of the U.S. ROK alliance, which we saw throughout the 80s and perhaps the 90s and the 90s. And the peak of that was reached in the presidential election of 2002, when, in fact, the alliance issue with the United States really became the defining factor which determined the outcome of the election itself. But then we see, remember in the most recent election in 2007, we see a radical shift away from national security issues or political issues, and we saw how the economy really became the issue around which the presidential election was contested. And then, of course, the candidate that said that had the Korean version of "it's the economy, stupid" actually won the election, and that was Lee Myung-bak. Now, I think what our survey shows is that it's that continuing trend away from politicization of security issues, alliance issues, and the public in general, but even especially the younger generation, becoming less interested in even reunification issues, and much more interested in social issues, for instance, which for the younger generation would be the most salient political issues, quote unquote. Now, so on the one hand, we have we see two trends here. So we see less interest in political issues or depoliticization of the alliance issues, which actually bodes well for the alliance itself. But the younger generation actually moving away from interest in these issues. The shorter-term trend that we also see, which further strengthens, I think, the public support for the alliance, is actually the current events that we see. So we see this long-term trend of depoliticization of the alliance issue, strengthening of the support, overall support for the alliance, and at the same time we see we've seen in the wake of the recent North Korean provocations, and for instance China's overt support of the North Korean position, we have a rapid turning away on the part of the Korean public away from any sense of illusion regarding China's role in the region. What I mean by that is that for a very long time, South Koreans, many South Koreans, especially since the normalization of South Korean relations with China, many have been working under the assumption that if we increased our trade with China, if we increased our interaction with China, that finally at some point China would come around and start looking at things from our perspective, especially when it came to North Korea. But I think this year, or last year now, actually proved to be really a turning point away from any sense of the illusion that China would eventually back us up when it actually came down to a real standoff between the two Koreas. And that shift, that sense of that sort of wakening up from that what turns out to be a false hope regarding the role of China, then really push the Korean public back into support for the alliance, which is actually shown by another survey that we've actually done immediately in the aftermath of the Yeonpyeong shelling. So we have both a long-term trend and a very short-term trend that is clearly making the South Korean public much more open and to and supportive of the alliance between Republic of Korea and the United States. So, what does all this mean for the elections, upcoming 2012 elections? I think one, of course, as long as China continues to side with North Korea, I think the conservative cause will be helped, which is very ironical. And I think if the conservatives were to win in 2012, I think the U.S. ROK and I should also mention, of course, even a budding South Korea-Japan military alliance, which is something we just could not imagine even a couple of years ago. But we now have North Korea and China to thank for the beginnings of that would continue to be strengthened. But I think there's also a sense in which Koreans are actually quite uncomfortable at this particular juncture with vis-a-vis in terms of our relationship with China, to be stuck, to be in a position where you rely on your security rely on the United States for security, and then for your largest trading partner is actually China. For South Korea, it's a very uncomfortable position to be in. So perhaps it could be that if China does come around and does things that South Korea expects it to do in terms of reining in perhaps North Korea, it might actually change the atmosphere quite a bit. But by and large, if the longer-term trend is correct, then it's unlikely that national security issue in itself will become a major focus of the election itself. We predict that it's actually going to be welfare issue, for instance. Again, that would become the central focus of the presidential contest. So, in conclusion, I think the alliance itself is on very firm foundation. One, because it's becoming less of a political issue. The younger generation is becoming very pragmatic regarding national issue because they think it's less of a issue regarding nationalism or national identity. And so, again, I think it bodes well for the future of the alliance. And let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jae-bong. Our final discussant is Bruce Klingner, who is the Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. He joined Heritage in 2007 after 20 years in the intelligence community working at the CIA and DIA and several years at the Eurasia Group. He's a distinguished graduate of the National War College, where he earned a master's degree in national security strategy in 2002. He also earned a master's in strategic intelligence from the Defense Intelligence College and a bachelor's in political science from Middlebury. Bruce, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Victor. I realize we're a bit behind schedule, and I'm the last person standing between a room full of people and happy hour, so I'll try to be quick, but please bear with me, because there's a lot of really excellent material, not only in the presentation, but also much more in the paper, which, like Gordon, I commend the audience to read. And it's also on a very important topic, not only to Seoul, but also to Washington, so sort of, again, bear with me. In the written paper, it makes clear that the overall purpose of the project was to identify what aspects of South Korean attitudes towards security issues will dominate or at least play a role in the 2012 South Korean elections, and that would not only be the presidential election, but also the National Assembly election. Now, obviously, it's very difficult to predict since we're so far out, and it very likely may revolve around a catalyst which hasn't even occurred yet. And like most elections, it will primarily resolve around economic issues or domestic issues. And the South Korean electorate, like many electorates, is, I'd say it as sort of 1/3 identify themselves as conservative, 1/3 identify themselves as progressives, and the middle third, what I call shallow water, which is easily swayed by whichever political wind is blowing prevalently at the time. And that's why we saw such a major shift in public support for Lee Myung-bak at the election, and then only 3 or 4 months later away from him during the beef protests. Also, security issues will be largely dependent on the South Korean electorate's view of North Korea at the time, driven by North Korean actions. And those, again, are impossible to predict. We may be in these 6 months of provocations or the subsequent 6 months of charm offensive. We're not sure quite which it'll be. And also it'll be driven by, as a result of North Korea's actions, the South Korean public's view of the utility of engagement in solving North Korea's actions. And the opposition, the DP or other opposition parties, the tone of their campaign and likelihood of victory will also be influenced by who they selected as a candidate. And as an example, we've recently seen a very public debate on the DP's views retroactively toward the Sunshine Policy, a debate between Chung Dong-yong and Son Ha-kyu. So depending on which of those, or perhaps another candidate, becomes the candidate for the DP, that will determine not only a retroactive view on Sunshine Policy, but also likely influence the DP's position on and policy towards North Korea that would come out in an election campaign. To expand on a point that came out in the presentation as well as the paper is that young Koreans in their 20s are as conservative as the Korean War generations in their attitudes towards national unification and military threats from the North. I just expand a bit and say that, yes, the 20-year-olds are conservative, but I think in a very different way from the older conservatives. For the older folks, even older than me, their attitudes are driven largely by the North Korean action in the invasion of their country, as well as the subsequent U.S. support during the war, as well as the reconstruction of their country. The young conservatism doesn't automatically equate to automatic support or even membership in the GNP. The people in their 20s are less likely to be a formal member of any political party, whether it's the GP or the DP. Also, the younger generation tends to define their position on an issue-by-issue basis rather than following a party line. They also are much more individualistic than their predecessors, even to the point of seemingly rejecting a common nomenclature for their generation. There's not a 386 nomenclature for their generation. People have tried Gen Y, Gen Z, millennials, even a 1929 generation, those between their 19 and 29 years. Also, as Dr. Han pointed out, they're very pragmatic, they're very entrepreneurial, so that they determine their position on an issue on how does it impact my ability to make money, so that unification and war are seen both negatively because they would negatively impact the South Korean economy. In looking at the actual public opinion results, it's very data rich, but as the authors point out, geopolitical realism has prevailed over nationalistic ideals that demanded independent or equal partnership with the U.S., and that this trend is likely to continue. So right now you have 87% of the people agree that the U.S. ROK alliance should continue, and I agree very strongly with that. And I think that high number is largely a result of the change from President Roh Moo-hyun to Lee Myung-bak. I mean, rather than having a president who said, what's wrong with being anti-American, and taking a number of positions that the U.S. saw as antithetical to common alliance objectives, you have a president who very clearly is trying to not only strengthen but transform the alliance. The second factor would be declining South Korean support for President Roh's policies, including engagement which was perceived as lacking conditionality and transparency, and also North Korean actions most certainly that we've seen provocations during the Obama administration last year, and then the very deadly provocations in the last year. The one factor which came up in the paper was the June 2010 election, and that it was driven in large part by the electorate questioning the veracity of the Cheonan investigation. But we had an interesting phenomena where 70% of the people polled said they believed that North Korea conducted the Cheonan attack. At the same time, 70% of the people didn't believe the government report which said North Korea conducted the attack. And so, you know, sort of the dichotomy between those two, I think, was largely a problem with the electorate's, you know, the electorate with MB and the perception that conservatives were manipulating that for an election. And an interesting question would be, had those local elections occurred after the Yongpyeong-do attack, would they have gone as well for the DP as they had in June? When, you know, after the Cheonan attack, 30% of the electorate identified security as of great concern, whereas after Yongpyeong-do, it was closer to 70 or 80%. Some interesting results in the poll is that, you know, North Korean nuclear problems have been a problem for 20 years. Who is primarily responsible? 65% North Korea, 16 U.S., 12 South Korea, and 5% China. I'd just sort of say, well, let's review. North Korea promised never to build nuclear weapons. North Korea built nuclear weapons. North Korea promised to give up the nuclear weapons that they would never build in the first place. North Korea has not done so. I'd really question, why would only 65% of the people blame North Korea? Why isn't it much higher? I'd surely put the blame on them. Some of the things that I saw, it seemed to be some disconnects in the respondents' views in the polls. Now, that may be either sort of the fickle respondents, or it could be responding to differences in how the different questions were worded. Or it may very well be that I was a political science major and I'm much more comfortable with nouns and verbs, and once we get into numbers and charts, it sort of goes over my head. But you know, some of the figures were 97%, 92% didn't believe North Korea would give up their nuclear weapons, but the majority of South Koreans also strongly prefer to see the nuclear issue resolved through diplomatic means and not by a hardline policy. So a question would be, how do you resolve a situation if you don't think they're going to give up the nuclear weapons at all, which, of course, is the definition of resolving the North Korean nuclear problem. Also, there was a response to, you know, which option do you see as the most desirable solution to the nuclear problem? 41% economic cooperation, 36% economic sanctions, 13% security assurances by the U.S., and 9% military pressure. I think what's missing there is where is diplomacy? You know, either coercive diplomacy or diplomatic engagement. And of course, you know, even if you add in diplomacy, all of those factors are not mutually exclusive. They should all be used in an overall comprehensive integrated strategy. So diplomacy and pressure really are two sides of the same coin. And also, even though those numbers were very high for persuasion instead of pressure, or for economic engagement, the polls also showed that 43% blamed both the Kim Dae-jung and the No administrations for being responsible for North Korea's development of nuclear weapons. And that was higher than the 35% which blamed the Lee Myung-bak government. Now, of course, the North Korean nuclear program was decades old by the time MB even walked into office. And also elsewhere in the polls, which again seemed to be a disconnect, was that a very high percentage favored continuing the overall direction of the current policy, North Korean policy of Lee Myung-bak, with only 30% favoring a more moderate approach, and 50% favored strong pressure such as economic sanctions to achieve North Korean denuclearization, while 43% favored dialogue and negotiation. Anyway, so again, it just seems some disconnects between some of the numbers. But I think more importantly, in conclusion, I'd very much agree with the author's conclusions that mutual trust between the U.S. and South Korea may well be the ultimate ingredient of the bilateral security alliance at its highest stage, but trust building cannot begin without pursuing mutual interests first. And really what we've seen is time and time again, the United States and South Korea have shared mutual national interests, and that is based on the same basic values we have of freedom, democracy, and free market principles. So because of that, I hope, and no, really, I'm confident that not only will the bilateral alliance and relationship remain strong, but will continue to transform and grow even stronger in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. So this is what I propose we do, since we are a little bit over time. There are already a lot of questions on the table that have been raised by the three discussants for the presenters. We'll take a couple of questions, and they have to be questions, from the audience to add to that, and then we will go to our presenters for some final remarks, and then we'll conclude with some final remarks from Dr. Hom. So the first, let's go to Mark Mannion from the Congressional Research Service.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. A couple of questions. First, great job. I can't wait to read the papers, although now you've made my work a lot harder, challenging some of my assumptions, particularly about the protests. One of the couple of questions. You did some correlations by ideology. I'm wondering if you also did correlations by economic class. And also, one of the things that's always struck me about South Korea is the difference between elite and non-elite. I mean, this isn't necessarily unique to South Korea, but I think it's perhaps more pervasive there. So did you do any work to try and tease that out? And I don't know what sort of proxies you'd use, maybe, the amount of time spent living overseas or connections to families overseas, but anyway, any way that you could tease out that differences in both class and also elite, non-elite, and their attitudes towards these various issues. If you haven't done that already, I'd encourage you to do that with future polls.
Thank you. And then I think Larry Nish had a question.
I wanted to ask Dr. Wu and Dr. Kim first. In terms of defining liberals and conservatives, did you find that in addition to this vagueness on economic and social issues, if there is any divide or definition to be made based on education issues, such as, for example, this issue of how much pressure to put on students with regard to the examination system, how history is being taught in South Korean schools? Is there an ideological bias to the teaching of history? The political stance of the major teachers union or ideological stance. Are these education issues kind of a defining element in defining conservatives versus liberals? And to Dr. Go, relatedly, the rumors you mentioned that arose among teenagers regarding mad cow beef and all of that, were these rumors something that just kind of sprang up spontaneously on the internet, or did Korean teachers have any role in instilling these kinds of rumors among their students?
Great, thank you. So why don't we go to our panelists, and I guess we can, Dr. Go, Dr. Kim, would you like to go first?
Thank you so much for the wonderful question. I'll go first in answering the question about the role of Korean teachers in aiding or spreading the rumors. Yeah, the interesting thing about the high school environment is that, as you might remember, that high schools, it's actually a very confined space. So it's not just the disease that spreads fast in that kind of confined space, but also information. So if you remember all these exaggerated rumors and stories and that you heard from your colleagues, fellow classmates. So actually, just if you think about it, that kind of rumors actually gets generated all the time, every day. So there's some random chance that I got picked up and expanded. It's there's some so there's a timing issue. So for some reason, for some random chance, the beef issue caught the attention of the high schoolers in Korea. and that actually spread to the rest of society. And the role of the Korean teachers, that actually was highly suspected by the government of Lee Myung-bak, because they couldn't believe how just like teenagers could be so organized and so could generate a body of knowledge. I mean, it's based on misinformation, but a huge body of knowledge about mad cow disease. So this really suspected the role of the teachers there. But if the government suspected that. But the thing is, if you just trace back what happened afterwards, is that if the Korean teachers had any hand on shaping the course of the events, you would have seen that the college students would also have been influenced by the Korean teachers' message, but we didn't see that. So we only saw the high schoolers reacting such a negative way, to a negative manner to the import of USPF. So I think there's no enough physical evidence to think that Korean teachers had any role.
First, about the economic class and the elite or non-elite, we do have control for the economic class by the income level and also the education in all the regressions. I just cut out of all the control variables for the presentation-wide. Interesting finding was that income does matter, but not the education, because I expected education would matter, but it was not. But the income level was negatively associated with the ideology. So the more higher income the person earns, then he's more likely to be a liberal than the conservative. But it is positively correlated with the partisan affiliation. So it was just a tentative conclusion from us that, okay, so those high-income people would like to say that, oh, I'm very liberal, I'm okay with the gay marriage, I'm okay with abortion. I respect the woman's right, but when it comes to the partisan choice, they are more likely to affiliate with the conservative parties. So that was quite interesting findings, actually. And about the education, we do not really have the question on that, but we do have the question of the teachers' union and how they evaluate the teachers' union and whether the ideology divides the attitude toward the teachers' union. It was not, really. Well, there's about 10% of conservatives, they have a negative feelings toward the teachers' union, but it's 60% of conservatives, but also the 45 or 50% of liberals also do have the negative attitude towards the teachers' union. So they are not really popular in Korea, regardless of the ideological stance of the respondents.
Great, thank you. Dr. Kim or Dr. Wu, do you have any?
For the questions by Mr. Snyder about there's no connection between ideology and party affiliation, I think we can answer that in terms of defining self-ideology, the attitude towards social issue is very important, but political parties in South Korea doesn't have any specific position, specific stance towards social issues. They only align themselves along with the security issues. So that's why the self-manifested ideology is not related with the party affiliation. So in that matter, for Korean political parties, if they want to appeal to younger generation or if they want to gather more people with their party support, they have to establish their stance in social issues. That's the implication that we can get from our survey and this study.
Great, thank you. For our final remarks, we will go to Director Ham Jae-won. Thanks.
Just one question that that Gordon raised about why the policy response, lack of policy response from the Blue House, and some of the policy implications, larger policy implications about future, what to do about future protests. Actually, I think because the Blue House did not understand this dynamics, they completely, we actually did a timeline as when the president came out to apologize. He actually came out twice, apologizing abjectly. Had absolutely no effect. In fact, anything that was right after the apology was the tipping point where the protest expanded exponentially, almost overnight, as it were. So, had they understood what was going on, I think the first policy response should have been to clamp down on the small protests, to stop it from happening. I think if had they stopped the protest within the first month, when it just simmered and there were kids sitting around in parks, right, in Cheonggyecheon, 5,000 at most. If the police had done something about that, then it might actually have been a completely different story. But they just let that simmer. So, one of the policy recommendations that we did make for using this analysis for a particular client in Korea was that, look, you stop these protests in their tracks when they're small. And we were very interested in seeing, right after this recommendation was made, we saw the police starting to close off this whole plaza. Right? They would actually bring the buses and completely seal off the plaza in front of Seoul. And I said, wow, that's really interesting, because that's exactly what we were actually saying. And so once you stop people from getting to these places, it actually has the effect. So we do have some policy recommendations. It's just not the kind of highbrow policy recommendations we normally would like to make. This is like how to cut down on strikes. I think if the government understood the dynamics of such information cascades and things like that, I think it could actually lead to some more concrete, effective policy recommendations. But with that, I just wanted to say that this is we really thought that this undertaking such a public opinion survey would be one of our signature platform for our new fledgling policy institute, and we really looked around to see what was one of the areas where we could make a difference, and we discovered that opinion surveys were, in terms of the methodology, in terms of scale, the ones that we have seen coming out of Korea were lacking in so many aspects, and we thought that this was one area where we could really make a contribution. And of course, having real good empirical evidence to base your policy suggestions and analyses on would be really important. So this is our first try at this, and as we said at the beginning, this will be part of our annual survey, and of course we will continue to conduct other surveys as well, and we really hope to share and release this information and share it as widely as possible with the policymaking community or policy debating community, both within and outside of Korea, and we really hope that this provides material for more in-depth and more sophisticated debate on issues relating to Korea. So again, I'd just like to thank Victor and CSIS for providing us this platform to try out this first alternative, first roadshow we're undertaking as with this survey. So thank you very much.
Let me just say in closing, thank you everybody for coming despite the weather. And again, I think that this project is an extremely important one. both in public policy and in terms of academic scholarship, because I participated in an American Political Science Association task force 2 years ago that looked at trying to understand how the world viewed the United States. And we did it by region and we did it by function, and I was responsible for Asia. But one of the things that came across clearly when we looked at all the regions was we knew a lot about the way countries viewed the United States, but we didn't know a lot about countries in terms of their own domestic preferences, how they self-identify as conservative versus liberals, what their views are on social issues, and we have a lot of sense of what their views are on foreign policy, but not on these issues. So it was a huge gaping hole that everybody in all the regions agreed was an important piece of research. And in that sense, I think ASAN really is blazing a trail here by doing some of the most sophisticated work in this area. So congratulations to you and to Ham Jae-bong for doing this sort of work.
Thanks.
Thanks.